It says now. All right. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Dev Empathy Book Club, where we inspire each other to become better developers and better people by building our empathy skills. Today, we are going to finish our discussion of Radical Candor by Kim Scott. It is a part 2. We covered part 1 a little over a month ago, and we're going to kind of talk about how we feel about the second half of this book and if that changed any of our thoughts on kind of the metric or the system of radical candor, and what does it mean to apply it. As a quick refresher, the book is kind of segmented into 2 parts, with the first part being this is the system, and the second part being this is the way you apply it in some ways. A little bit less theory and more actual stories. And so Ariel, what were your thoughts or your general takeaways on the second half?
Sure, I liked it a lot more than the first half. I think that in general, the first half was a little more philosophical. The second half was more hands-on, which was kind of the point. More specifically, just the fact that there were a lot of management practices in part 2 that you didn't really have to buy into the whole system. So in part 1, there was sort of this idea of radical candor, and then here's a bunch of ideas that emerged kind of naturally from radical candor, and there was a lot to disagree with there. I think definitely the de-emphasis of how you say it in terms of in favor of what you say, that I think it bothered you as well, Justin, if I recall correctly. In the second half, there was a lot less. I mean, it used the words radical candor a lot. You could kind of delete every time it says radical candor, and you'd still have a pretty decent handbook of management practices. And we'll get into a lot of the specifics. Some of them I think were really intriguing or interesting. Some of them I think were, okay. Some I thought might be possibly sometimes in certain circumstances counterproductive, although I'm not a manager, so it's sort of hard for me to speak from experience, but just based on my intuitions. But in general, a lot of the practices and the ideas that were brought up in part 2 made me think differently about the things that I see, and how I might run things, and how some of the things that I originally might have thought were less than ideal, I now look back at that, meaning in terms of my own work environment. I look at these things now and I say, well, actually, I kind of understand a little bit more where that's coming from and why that might not be so bad.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with a lot of that. I will definitely say I like the second half of this book a lot more than the first half, and it was fun to kind of see, like, okay, from the second half, you can see how the first half came into existence, if that makes sense. Like the second half was very clearly, these are the things I've done, these are the things I've lived, these are the things I've implemented, and then from that, from the lifetime of this career, you can see, oh, look, I came across this common thread between all of these that led to better teams and better workplaces. And I think there was a lot to take away. I think, like you said, with most of these, and with most of these books, not everything counts. I mean, there's always like a few misses. And I think that's because everyone's situation is so different. I mean, I can admit I've never worked at a company 1/10 of the size of Google, and I've never been a manager of managers. I've been a boss. I've hired, I've fired, I've managed. For me, I felt personally a few times reading this book like, oh, this is just for me. I'm the only one on this podcast. This is really important for right now. Because like I have an employee who I hired, who is my employee, which I don't ever get used to saying, in their yearly review is coming up in a couple months. I have no idea how to run a yearly review when I get to outline the framework. Mostly I've always been given, this is how reviews work. You do it this way. Now I get to decide what that looks like. So when that chapter came up, I was like listening to the audiobook and writing notes. I'm like, oh, that's good. Oh, that's bad. Oh, that's good. And, trying to decide what makes sense at a company of 3 versus a team of 40. Like the scale is so different. Like I could easily see being bogged down in it. But I will say there were less points in this second half that I was immediately taking umbrage with, like in the first one. The first one, we talked about it at length, so I won't go into it. But there was times when I would just be like, no, I don't. Definitely, I disagree with the premise here. The second half, it was like, okay, there's a lot of good here. I have to just see if this is something that applies to my situation. I don't think I'm going to be running skip meetings anytime soon, for example.
Yeah, I think that's probably a point that we're going to come back to very frequently, just because both of us do work on smaller teams, certainly than, I mean, your entire company and even mine, at I think we're about 260 at this point, are still smaller than some of the teams, just, not even the whole company, but the individual team that the author was working with. And that's going to have a major impact on the need for some of these practices and on the efficacy of some of these practices.
Yeah, I completely agree. One thing that came up that I know you would have wrote down, Ariel, was in a situation where they basically were using NVC. I definitely noticed that as well. I didn't write it down. I was like, hey, this is nonviolent communication happening here. And I think it was around page 137. You said there's a part here about situation, behavior, and impact. And this idea of approaching the problem and the behavior versus attacking the person themselves. So that came up a few times in different chapters, especially with like the attribution error and like understanding how to deal with people. And I thought that was good. And do you have any thoughts particularly on that point?
Yeah. So situation, behavior, impact, and this is something that, anytime I talk about this, I like to emphasize that we're never talking about what's the right thing to do. We're talking about what's the most effective way to go about handling a situation. So, we can talk from now till forever about morals and principles and what's right and wrong, and what's the right way to handle it when there is a bad actor. And that's I think usually the way that people tend to approach these situations, and it's not the most effective way to do it. And I think situation, behavior, impact really gets right to that. So, like think about, the last time that you saw somebody, or two people get into like a war on, in some open source project or on Twitter, and like generally someone said something that caused the other person to feel hurt. Mm-hmm. And the person basically expresses that they're hurt, usually by an attack on the first person, and then person one will say, oh, well, you shouldn't have understood it like that, or it's your problem, or I was justified in saying it. And I think the whole point of situation, behavior, impact is it doesn't matter. It's really impact above all, and that's kind of a hard concept for a lot of people to understand, but it's a really important one if you want to lead effectively, because if you show up and tell somebody you did the wrong thing here, even if you tell them why, but ultimately it's a judgment, they're going to feel attacked. They're going to try to defend themselves in any way that they can. And you're not really going to have any impact beyond the current situation that you're trying to handle. If you say, it doesn't matter whether you were right or wrong. The point is that here was the situation that you were in. Here is the behavior that you exerted. And here's the impact that it had on somebody else. Mm-hmm. Right? If you'd like this impact to not happen in the future, here's how you have to change your behavior in this kind of situation. And people really respond to that a lot better most of the time. And if they don't respond well, then of course, that what their motivation was. They really were malicious about it. Like they just don't care that they're hurting somebody else. But at least And I think that was sort of the tongue-in-cheek way that the author said it, right? That instead of calling someone a name, first, ascertain what their motivations were, tell them that when you did this, there was this impact. And then when they say that they don't care, then you can call them a name, but, be, feel righteous in doing so, feel justified.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think giving people the benefit of the doubt is always the best way to do things, especially when it comes to situations where a change in behavior would change the potential impact. Like there are a lot of times when people do mess up, and sometimes they are just dumb. It's like sometimes, like I mean that, and I don't mean that in a condescending way, but sometimes like I have some coworkers I've had in the past where they'll just say something. I'm like, hey, that really hurt this person, and you didn't mean to. I know you didn't mean to, but you need to change that. And they're like, oh my God, I just didn't realize, and they were able to make that change. But I've also worked with people who, when you just suggest they have to behave differently, they completely blow off the handle. And they're just like, no, I'm not changing the way I act. And then there's an issue. Now we have a concrete, we've been told, we brought this issue up. It caused this impact to these people. And this person is unwilling to make any concessions for the actual impact or damage potentially that their actions are having. And then you have like a case to actually bring something up. And I thought that was good from a manager's perspective, especially because it's really hard with managers and to be on this side of things, because I don't think this came up in that chapter, but like, power dynamics are such a big thing. And if you're a boss, like, you're the boss. Like, it's tough. I think I tell myself that every day coming in the office, not I'm the boss, because that's dumb. But like, I will say, like, I need to remember that everyone who works, with me works for me in some reason. I can't just pretend I'm not the boss. Like, that will everything I say will have weight. And that comes up in a later chapter, which we'll talk about in a minute. But like, that's something I have to keep in mind. When I was a manager, that was true as well. When I used to manage a bunch of instructors at a code school, it was like, what I say affects the way they then go on the rest of their day, because I am, quote unquote, the manager of them. And so it's very important, if you are accusing or not, if you're not trying to be accusational, that you discuss the situation, behavior over, hey, you idiot, you need to knock this off. Like, that's going to become a much more confrontational, and what you say holds more weight than like a peer would if they said something similar. So it's good. It's good that was in there. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Cool. So something kind of related to what I just talked about, which was the idea of soliciting feedback. This is something that's been near and dear to my brain recently, which is the idea of getting feedback as a boss or to your boss. Like, the idea of, with the Radical Candor framework in a company, it's okay to criticize your boss. And in my situation, I am the boss, to criticize me. It's okay. And I have to think, like, do my current employees ever do anything that criticizes me? And I don't really think of many situations. And that made me, I really was like, oh, well, that's because I'm doing an okay job. And I'm like, well, probably they just, are either unsure about saying something or feel like it doesn't need to be said. One of those two things. And one thing I'm planning on trying to implement over the next couple, weeks and months is making that a safer spot for them to say something. Like, they feel like they can actually come to me and say, hey, like, I don't think it was cool that you changed our meeting because you double booked yourself with a podcast. Like, don't do that. I would appreciate it. That they would probably really enjoy that, but they don't feel like they have to tell me that. So what you had noted on, Ariel, was the idea of maybe making this anonymous, and how that can actually help people want to say something they might not otherwise. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's less a matter of you always have to be anonymous. I think that there's a place for anonymous, and there's a place for taking ownership of your comments, because that gives you the opportunity to explain it more. The system that, or one of the systems that that Scott talks about is basically putting up like the Radical Candor, again, assuming you buy into the whole quadrant system, but okay, let's go with that. So, putting up the Radical Candor for quadrants diagram on like a big board. And this is assuming, of course, you're in the same physical office. I think they have something on their site where you can do it virtually. And people just leave Post-it notes on there saying, here's something where you demonstrated, in any of these quadrants. And what struck me about that is, obviously handwriting is an issue, so maybe you have to have people like print out their notes or something, but you have a way for people to submit feedback anonymously, and then you can show how you respond to it. This is sort of the catch-22 that the book pointed to a lot, which is that it's very hard to get that first round of negative feedback, because once you get that and you show that you're able to take it, you're not just dishing out, you're also able to accept it and to grow from it, and not to yell at the person who's giving you the negative feedback, not to judge them, not to dismiss the feedback, but actually to take it into account and think about it and work on fixing it. Then people will start feeling much more comfortable giving negative feedback in the future. So so to me, it's sort of like this brilliant way of starting that loop, because you will get those anonymous bits of negative feedback if you make the room for it. And then once you show that you're able to deal with negative feedback in an appropriate way, people are going to be much more comfortable doing it in a non-anonymous fashion.
Yeah, I can think back at a few companies I worked at where if there had been an anonymous feedback mechanism for higher ups in the company, it would have been used a lot, and it might have been a little controversial at the time, which is probably why it never existed if I think back on it. But it would have been great. It probably could have prevented people from quitting if I think back on it, because there were people who felt they literally had no way to speak up the hill. Sometimes it was like a skip up was the problem. Like I, as the manager, would listen to them, but then I would tell to my boss and it would get lost somewhere up the chain. And then they would feel like it doesn't matter who they tell, it doesn't go anywhere. And they didn't feel like they could criticize anyone effectively. And I think an anonymous system like this would allow those people who feel more nervous to be able to say things. The first time this came up to me at a company, in like an all hands meeting virtually, chimed in on something the CTO said. I was like, I think that's a bad idea. And I kind of listed off a few reasons. And I wasn't trying to be rude. Like I've known the CTO since we had like 12 people in the company. Like we're pretty close. And I wasn't trying to be rude, but then someone else messaged me and was like, oh my God, I feel the same way. And I got 2 other people messaging me also saying they felt the same way. And then I was like, yeah, but in the meeting, I looked like I was alone. I was the only person on my side of that argument. And they basically all said the same thing. Like they felt like they had no political capital to spend, but I had been around the longest. So I was allowed to say it and they weren't. And I was like, well, no, I'm not allowed to say any more than you are. But it was true. It wasn't my right to just deny them that. Like there was a real tangible thing in their minds of, I've been around, I can say that, they can't. Like they're a new hire. They're not allowed to say the CTO has a bad idea for how to implement this, So yeah, that anonymous feedback might have helped. It might have given them a way to express their concerns without feeling like they are ostracizing themselves from the culture of of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because what you were talking about reminded me of the fact that I've actually tried to give more negative feedback up the chain while reading this book, just to see what happens.
Just kind of poking the bear with a stick.
You got to watch out for your job security when you do that. But it's been interesting to see what happens when different people get poked and how they react, and not everybody reacts the same way, but. Yep. But some people really appreciate it because they never hear anything negative. And I think the further up you go, especially in a larger company, the further up the chain that you go, it's not going to be the same with some people. Really only want to hear good things about themselves. But yeah, if that's not the case, people the higher up the chain you go, the less negative you hear, the more people are hip hip hooray-ing your ideas. So when you hear that feedback from someone below you, it's like even more refreshing because it's so rare.
Right. And it feels like that's someone you can trust a little more because they're willing to be honest with you in some ways,
Yeah, exactly. But it's not a guarantee. So, it's a little bit like, what's the word, poking a bear with a stick.
Yeah. You get prod it a little bit, just see what happens. Hopefully the bear's, full or whatever.
Exactly.
Good. Yeah. I think in general, I don't, maybe I should save this for later for full takeaways, but chapters like that where like, this is something that's not in the current mythos, like contrasting this with Mythical Man Month, where like that's what people do. Like what's the point of reading this book? Everyone already does whatever they're saying. I don't think a lot of things in this book are universal. Like I think some big companies do them. A lot of big companies do them wrong, and a lot of companies just don't care to do them. So I'd be very curious to see what impact this book has 5-10 years out. Like how many people do pick this up and read it? Like, does this become like new required reading for managers, or is this just like a flash in the pan kind of a thing? Like, I don't know. This is the first book we've read that's like recent. This is like 2017, right? So it's like brand new compared to everything else we've read. So I'm kind of curious how the impact washes out.
That's a good point, and it's sort of funny because the book is a little bit rough around the edges. There's a lot of times when you're reading it and you're like, you almost feel like it was rushed, rushed to press a little bit faster. I think that might be just a matter of, the way that books are written has changed. The barrier to publishing is a little bit lower, and that's not a criticism of the content of the book. It's just. As I've spent a lot of years of my life in one form or another editing publications, and so like I have a pretty good feel for what's something that's heavily edited and what's something that's not. And this was much more, the tone was conversational, but it also felt a lot less authoritative. And I think the reason is that it's not authoritative because these aren't practices that have been done for 20 years in big companies. And maybe it's also a matter of a little bit of the humility of the author. When you compare it to Brooks, I think there's a little bit less humility there, a little bit more self-assuredness.
Oh, agreed. Yeah, and that might just be something that we need to consider when we're reading books from different backgrounds or more modern settings. Maybe the book was written in a move fast and break things methodology. I don't know, but I think maybe he said the humility, the point of view of the author might make a big difference, and which brings us kind of to our next talking point about how gender and gender roles interact with radical candor. As we said before, the author is a woman, and I think that's really important. Like, I really appreciate her perspective from this. I think this book would be good if it was completely written from a male's perspective, but it would be very different. Like, this is not only just a unique perspective with someone with a very unique and storied career, but someone who can speak to kind of both sides of how management feels, especially from someone who has been subjected to sexism in the workplace and told some stories about that and how that's affected her career. And I could tell countless stories just about my friends and the stuff they've dealt with in their careers and how that's messed with them. And I think having it brought up was nice. And there was a few points here that I was kind of read off that Ariel, you had taken the opportunity to write down, which was, one is to avoid gendered language whenever possible. And the classic "Hey guys" is a big one. I was able to cheat with this one, which was I moved to Texas. So if anyone ever wants to get out of saying "Hi guys," I just say move to Texas, because then you're allowed to say "y'all" and no one ever thinks it's weird. And I just was able to very quickly operate over to saying "y'all," and I've been pretty good at it so far. But the idea, also the other things that you had touched on were don't focus on the likability of the person. This is a big one when it comes to subconscious gender perceptions, what we all have, and it's just hard. It's a hardwired thing we have to kind of unlearn throughout our careers. And then the final thing was, don't write men off as far as listen to their stories. Men can still experience sexism in the workplace. Men can still deal with issues of discrimination. It's just a different perspective, a different story. So it's interesting. You should still listen to them,
So I just want to kind of cut in on that one. Because I assume that you're doing based on the list that I wrote down. So I see I didn't write it down very well. So the context of that was the story about how she spoke about some sexism research with her father, and her father, basically, and her father also cares about advancing women in the workplace, very deeply. But basically his response was, yeah, it's really a big problem, and also it's a shame that just some women aren't more likable or something like that.
Yeah.
And basically just kind of fell into that trap. And she said, because it was my dad, I had to, pause for a minute and not just immediately get angry and start yelling at him, but instead I was able to calmly point out to him the error that he had just made, even according to his own reasoning, he just hadn't noticed it. And he accepted the feedback and was able to move on. So the point being that just because someone makes a mistake once doesn't mean that now they are a sexist from now and forever. I generally don't like labels. So whether it's sexism, racism, whatever it is, I mean, the studies show that we're all racist and we're all sexist. So I'm not sure even what, that I just don't think it's a binary, which is why I don't like the label. I think it's a spectrum where we all end up. But I think that's exactly the point, is that the goal is not to turn off the sexism gene, right? It's to help people move along that spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. It's a conscious effort to undo your own cultural programming. You have a default way of thinking, and it's just because your default way of thinking is wrong does not mean you are inherently a bad person, but you need to make the effort to change. And I think that goes down to the idea of adjusting the behavior as well, not addressing the person directly. And I've worked at places where people I worked with have said very sexist things, and literally a year later, they are the one yelling at other people like, hey, you can't say that kind of stuff. Like, that is horrible. Do you have any idea what that means? And I'm just like, that's impressive. Like, this is a 180 from 9 months ago. And it's just because they were completely unaware, or they had false assumptions, and they just needed that push to get them in the right spot. And I would say, as a manager, it is kind of your job to help them, like to do that for them. Like, you should give them that push towards doing this in the right way. Yeah.
And of course, when someone, especially if it's, I guess if we're talking about sexism, right? But, it could apply to any of the isms. If somebody points out that you're doing it, right, that's just another piece of negative feedback that you take in and that you accept. First of all, you accept that, yes, this is absolutely their experience. And whatever were your intentions, that is the way things happen according to them. And accept their experiences, accept their emotions, and look at how you can make life better for them and for your entire team. I did want to share a story here, which I think is kind of instructive. This is just a personal story. So last time I was at RailsConf, I was having a chat with Sarah May, and I was talking about some anonymous feedback I had received on a presentation that I had given at a previous conference. They actually did a really nice thing. They kind of tabulated feedback from a whole bunch of attendees and then gave it to the speaker, which helps you, positive and negative feedback, right? Helps you iterate on your presentation and on your skills, which was really nice. So I mentioned that there was one particular piece of negative feedback that I had gotten that was a little bit, shocking. And of course, it's anonymous feedback. You have no idea who's giving it. But for some reason, despite the fact that I usually try to be careful about these things, I referred to the person who had given it as a he. Maybe I associate, men with harsher feedback. I'm not sure. But the point is, it doesn't matter, right? It's just about, this is something that you don't do. So she didn't even point out that I'd done anything wrong, right? And I'm fairly certain that she heard me say he. What she did is just in her response, she used the word they in place of he. And immediately I picked up on what I had done and just continued the conversation in that way. And I think it's just a really good example of how you don't have to, immediately the second a person, makes a mistake, does a thing that you don't think is appropriate. You don't have to jump on them for it. You give them a chance to correct themselves, and you make it clear, this is how I would like things to be done. This was an extremely subtle example. I don't think it always has to be this subtle, but I just think it was a really profound lesson to me in terms of the degree of subtlety you can use sometimes in correcting a person, and sometimes they'll actually pick up on it, and they'll change on their own just by seeing the right example.
Yeah, this is something that I have set as a personal goal of mine to get better at, which is using non-gendered pronouns and terms whenever I can. And it's not like it's a big effort on my part. It's just like, just keep one extra pause, one extra beat between things I say, and you can slot they or them in there, and it works almost all of the time. Like, it just fits. No one notices. No one ever calls you out for saying it, because it just makes it more accessible for everyone. And like, language is very important. And I definitely am big on that, on using the word they, for not just for, the potential of the receiver being male or female, but for anyone who's, non-binary, for how they might feel about it. I have a few friends who are non-binary, and it takes a little bit of time to get used to referring to someone as them, when you already have in your brain, again, like a hard-coded, you want to go to male or female for whatever reason. And for all of them, it's like, just don't mess up and try. Like, just try your best. You're going to mess up sometimes. None of them have ever yelled at me over it. It's always just kind of been like, they nod, and then, again, they're slowly correct by just saying it correctly, and you'll go, oh God, I did it. I did the thing, it happened. But, you get better. And I think having that attention to detail shows you care. And I think that was a big part of Radical Candor. And I think that would show as a manager that you seem to actually do care about your team. It would show that you care about different people from different genders, different gender expressions, if you use these non-gendered language instead of just doing he, him for everything. At the point I'm at, like I said with previous books we've read, if every single example in a test file is he, him, or in a book, it's all he, him, I'm like, oh God. Like, it gets to you really quickly if you ever step out of that bubble of everyone's John Doe And every example is then he, and then he, and then he, does that. I once had a pair reach out to me after programming and said that they really appreciated that half of my examples were women because they had never paired with anyone to that point that had used women in code examples. And I was like, really? Ugh. But, I'm glad you appreciated it. You know what I mean?
So I want to tell you a story about a, how would I even describe her? No, we met at a conference. I ended up hiring her for, or recruiting her to my company, and
Mm-hmm.
we've worked, together in various situations for the last few years. So I could say coworker, I could say friend. I knew her before she was a coworker, so there you go. But we met at RailsConf. This is like already a good number of years back. And she was talking to Olivier Lasson, who's one of the people at Code School, at least he was at the time. I think he still is. And she was discussing this exact issue, right? Of the fact that I didn't mention her name, by the way, Liz Serta. So there you go. So she was talking to Olivier about this issue of not having women's names in examples.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what came out of the conversation was, oh, this is interesting. In Rails for Zombies, I think is what the course is called, which is like, it's like one of the standard intro to Rails courses that like thousands and thousands of people go through as like their intro to programming. All of the names of users in the entire course were male. And and it's a small thing in some sense, but in another sense, it's a really big thing. It's sort of saying that, welcome, you're entering a man's world. And out of that conversation that I happened to, to have the privilege to sit in on, Code School actually changed the course to have equal representation of men's and women's names, or male and female names in the course. So it's a small thing that might just have had a big impact on some people's lives.
Right, exactly. And this is the kind of thing where sometimes it's subconscious. Sometimes people don't notice, but if you are that minority in that situation, you do notice. Like, it's really easy for someone, like myself or someone in my position, being the majority in an industry, to be like, oh, how would you ever know? It's like, oh, you'll know. if you were the only person that speaks English on your team, you would notice, I think, pretty quickly. That's a great example, but I think it kind of applies. Like I don't know a single, female friend of mine who works in the industry who has not noticed very clearly what the ratio is at any job they've worked. It's something they noticed probably during the interview process, and it's something they had to account for. I remember talking to a former student of mine, and she was like debating whether or not she wanted to work for this company because she would be the only female developer there. The only other woman she saw walking around was one project manager and the secretary. And like, they seemed nice, but that made her uncomfortable. Like, they could have been a fine company, but because they don't have anyone and they're already at like 50 employees or 50 developers, it seemed like they would be the person who's like the one woman on the team. And that made them feel uncomfortable. And they had to really debate whether or not they want to take that job. So it's like, it's something that even a small thing like changing the names in a course about learning Ruby on Rails can help people feel more comfortable and realize that the industry is not all men everywhere, and that it's something we're trying to change actively to just be a little bit more equitable when we can.
Yep. It's a long road though.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a long one. Was there anything else you want to add on the gender thing?
Yeah, so there is one thing that sort of occurred to me, and this was not from the book itself. But when we talk about situations where men and women offer the same criticism and it's taken differently, because of the person who's given it. It was giving it, not given, giving it. So my suspicion, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts as to whether this is true, is that obviously there's some amount that's always just going to be, I dismiss it because she's bossy versus I accept it because he's being assertive. That's going to be there. but I think there may be a way to at least mitigate it somewhat. For because look, we can talk about all day about how much the person who's being given the criticism should change, but it's not always something that we have any control over. We do have control over what we say and what we do. So if I'm the one who's giving the criticism, I think this honestly applies to, it applies to men and women. I just think it might be helpful also in kind of narrowing that gap is the less ambiguity there is, or the more there is to, sorry, I'll put it this way, the more there is to argue with the criticism, the easier it is to dismiss for whatever reason, whether it's, a legitimate reason or because of the gender of the person who's giving it. And the way to be less ambiguous is to stick more to facts and less to judgments. So it's one thing you can't say, oh, because you're being bossy, therefore I've decided that these 6 facts that you've pointed out are not true, right? Now there are people who really are jerks enough to do that, but I think generally the closer you stick to the objective facts of the situation, the harder it is to reject the criticism based on the person themselves who's giving it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. That reminds me, that to me feels like folding nonviolent communication in to your conversations, because there was a whole section of that which was about being unambiguous in the things you're addressing people with, and being like, okay, let's talk about facts. Let's talk about not my feelings. Let's talk about this actual what's happening here. And that might be something that needs to occur on all spectrums with the people giving feedback. It's like how to give effective feedback and how to reduce potential implicit bias based on the words you use, the way you write it, because that's the same thing where everyone receives feedback differently. And there was a chapter where she kind of touched on the idea of how people feel about feedback and how they might receive it. And kind of as the manager, you should kind of know that and then kind of adjust accordingly. But if you have everyone kind of giving feedback back and forth, you're going to have issues where everyone's going to write it assuming they're the one receiving it and they're write it the way they want to give it. And I think a general training over how to give effective feedback that's a little standardized, almost like a PR code review style guide. Like, okay, this is how you give feedback to your teammates, and I think that would help a lot to reduce some of that implicit bias, and also just general gender and discrimination awareness, like understanding that you have this bias is really helpful. Like for a lot of men I've worked with, just being told, hey, this is something you might feel or something you might think, without even considering it, they go, oh yeah, you're right. Like they just go, oh, like a light bulb goes off immediately. It's like, okay, good. I've been told that now. I will now think that when I'm receiving feedback,
Exactly.
Yeah. And
I think that's exactly the point, right? It's this sort of, there's 2 battlefronts here always, right? There's the how do we change the way people think in the long term, and there's in the short term, people need a solution to their problems today. We can't wait 20 years or 200 years or 2,000 years for society to change enough that gender bias is a non-issue. Which who says it's ever going to be a non-issue? Who says that we can even educate effectively enough? I don't know. But right now, we have a reality that people are dealing with gender bias, and we need solutions that work in the short term until we're able to really solve this. And pointing fingers at the people who, yes, legitimately are morally wrong in this context won't actually help solve the problem today. It might solve the problem 100 years from now, but it's not going to solve the problems that we're having today. It might make us feel better to complain about it, but it's not moving us forward in the short term. And I think that's why you have to always think about the 2 battlefronts and address them separately.
Yeah, I completely agree. I had a small nit I wanted to pick around this topic because it was the only spot in the entire second part while I was listening to it, and I was like, oh, come on. But I don't know how deep I want to dive into it. I'm trying to debate if it's even worth opening that can and then putting it away, there was like not even a whole chapter. It was like a 1-page section of another chapter talking about the danger of identity politics and how it will destroy your company culture. And I was just like, where did this come from? Because like it just came out of left field, and I was like, this sounds like every sexism is evil bro I know who's like 45 and just is not into, it's destroying colleges and now it's destroying like startups. And I was like, what? And I mean, my 2 cents on this, being a highly qualified dude, is like I can here, I'll take the NVC framework for this. I can acknowledge that there is a level of not abuse, but there's a level of like trepidation people adopt because of the current environment we are in today's society, with people addressing sexism complaints, people addressing issues of potential harassment. But I think the reports of my death have been wildly exaggerated. Like,
yep.
The reports of the effect of this in the workplace is so wildly disproportionate. Like, I will agree, there are individuals who have more notoriety, face time, so to speak. Like, if you're famous, you are going to get way more shit than you would otherwise. Like, it's going to happen. But a general person in a company, if they understand boundaries and listening to people and have understanding of like, how potential discrimination works, like the general sensitivity training we're talking about, they're not going to just accidentally stumble into something. Like there was a weird spot where it immediately jumped into, oh, these identity politics are going to ruin your company. I was like, well, I think everyone can have the identity they want to have, and you can run a respectful organization. It's not going to ruin anything. But yes, you do have to just have general awareness of it. It's not, going to just destroy everything. But I don't know. That was the one part of this whole thing, which all of it was good. And then I was just like, oh, that one couple pages I could have done without. Or maybe they need refinement is what it is. I'd be curious to see what the 2020 edition of this is and to see how we've gone from here. Because clearly this was written in like 2015, 2016, when there was a slightly different lens to how people were approaching these issues,
Yeah. And it also could be different in California, for the record. I don't know.
That's true. That is true.
I wouldn't be shocked if it was. I wouldn't be shocked if it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the stories I've heard, yes, people in the Silicon Valley area are just like walking around like, oh no, when's the next landmine going to go off? And it's like, well, it's not a lot to just like be a good person sometimes, you know what I mean? Like, but again, there's a lack of education. So there are people who are aware of potential consequences, but they're not aware of what to do and not to do. And for anyone who knows what to do and not to do, it seems ridiculous. Like, don't do X, Y, and Z and you're good. But like, I guess to a lot of people, they're not there yet. And, some more generalized education is probably needed, but that was the last thing on that I want to talk about.
I do want to throw in one point, and I'm not going to address that entire section because it's funny. I had to sort of like put that out of my head because I sort of read it. I was like, okay, it's a perspective.
It is that.
And there's definitely a grain of truth in it, and there's definitely things where like you said, the fears are somewhat overblown. Mm-hmm. At least for the contexts that we are familiar with at the time that we live in.
For our perspective,
a whole 2 years later. But I think actually that's something that I mentioned a bit earlier may be very relevant here. I mean, there was one point which she brought up, which I thought did have a lot of merit. Which was, on one hand, yes, gender bias is a thing, and you can apply that to, to gender, to race, to a whole bunch of other stuff. So those are absolutely things, and you have to be aware of them, both from the side of the person who, who has to control themselves to not be swayed by it as much as possible, and from the side of the other person who, needs to recognize when it's happening so they can call it out and help the other person, see things accurately. But just because these things exist doesn't mean that that's always behind, let's say rejecting a criticism, right? It could be that you're just wrong. Sometimes, believe it or not, right, women are wrong. So that was sort of the message in the book is women are seen to be wrong more often than they actually are. That doesn't mean that they're never wrong. It doesn't mean that they're always wrong, right? It's, human beings, right? All of us. So, let's say that that you're trying to, let's say you are, let's say, a man, and you have a woman who comes to you and gives you some kind of negative feedback, and you're going to reject it, right? And you're rejecting it for reasons that you think are reasonable. and you want to make it very clear that yes, you consider the gender bias element, and you're not doing it because of that, right? Well, it turns out that if I say I'm not doing it because of gender bias, it doesn't actually mean anything, right? Because you could easily be doing it and just convince yourself that you didn't. So instead, I think it goes back to what I said before. You always have to focus on the facts. You have to focus on not judgment, not morally debating this way, that way. Just focus on here are the reasons that I disagree, or if let's say you're criticizing someone's performance, criticize specific things that they did, point out here's why this was not helpful, back to situation, behavior, impact. Those are the things that are going to help you both make sure that your own feedback is not swayed by one of these biases, and also help the other person see that indeed it's not swayed by one of these biases. Yeah,
no, I completely agree. And the way I've tried to describe this to like coworkers and friends of mine in the past, when they brought up this issue of like, well, everyone's wrong sometimes. How do you like navigate where if you're the boss, you're giving someone feedback, they don't assume you're doing it because of their, potential minority status in the company or in the culture in a greater degree. And the way I've tried to describe it to them is like, your actions matter. And this is where the idea of like, if you don't know anything about your boss, or if worse, the only thing you know about your boss is he finds a certain class of joke very funny that you find kind of offensive. When you get that feedback, you're more likely to probably assume that gender bias has some play into it, right? If their actions and their words are constantly reflecting that is not something that they permit or that they allow, and they're consciously trying to get better, you as an individual have more standing to say, okay, this doesn't feel like this was gender, sexually identification, or racially motivated in any subconscious way. This is potentially just the actual feedback I'm getting. Same thing with like giving more feedback more often, allows that to be like a standard. So there's a chart where you can see, okay, there's something happening here, versus just coming out of nowhere with some potential feedback that could be taken very, could be taken wrong. And I think that's where people get scared, is they're used to not having to worry about it being an issue. And now that it potentially is an issue, they have to address the way they work. And I don't think people like changing the way they do things because it's like, it's not easy, and I think that's where the rub is. People just don't want to have to change up the way they run things day to day. All right. We could talk about this for 18 more hours, but Google Hangouts would have cut us off. So well, let's go.
We have a full 8 for the record.
Oh, we have a full 8. Okay, good. We can keep going. We'll keep you up until the wee hours of the morning. But let's move on to some more meeting stuff, some more managerial stuff. So one thing I actually found very interesting, I know you did as well, which was the idea of splitting decision-making meetings from debate meetings. I will say, I don't think I've ever had a debate meeting. Every meeting we've ever had has, I guess, been a decision meeting, and then either they're nice and quick and everyone agrees, or they take forever. So I think this is kind of a way to kind of change that. What are your kind of thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of another word for, or another way of describing a brainstorming meeting and a decision-making meeting. So I don't think it's necessarily, wildly different, although I guess here, talking about big debate as here's where we air all of our concerns. And that may be a little bit different than bringing up ideas. But I think it's definitely intriguing. I don't have much to add from an experience perspective because I haven't tried it per se. Yeah. I was mostly concerned about the big decision having a decider person, like an assigned decider. Maybe that's really important on large teams. It's possible that that's just the experience that she had. I don't know, on small teams, it seems like usually you can get enough consensus to make it work. And in cases where someone is really, dragging on the debate for too long, it's probably the job of the manager to jump in and again, it's hard to do this in the middle of one meeting, but it's not that hard to say, okay, we're, like a time box is one thing that people use. But if you're able to get them outside of the meeting to kind of explain to the person, I'm a little concerned about how we're carrying on this debate because, you're pushing this for a very long time and we need to make a decision on this. I think that there are kind of gentler ways of handling that won't involve a lot of resentment against the person who now has that decision on their shoulders.
Yeah.
Consensus is a big deal for creating strong teams.
Yeah. One thing I considered with this was I think from our perspective, we do a lot of decision making that potentially has correct answers. Like from the kind of meetings they talked about having, and the kind of meetings I know teams like that have, it's like all bike shed all the time, right? Like it's like there's no like, oh, let's pull up a study. I mean, sometimes there are if they're doing some kind of like user experience type thing, but when it's like, oh, we're playing this initiative that has a vague goal of increasing signups by 500% in Singapore over this time period, and these are the 15 different ways we want to do that. Like, there's no way for them to know at that high level what's going to work. So then I think maybe with that type of a group, it might be harder to make a decision, because they talked a lot about ego being tied up in it. And ego definitely comes into play with software, but in most small agile teams, most people are just recommending what they think is best. And you just don't do a consensus for what's the best compromise between two good or two bad ideas. As it tends to be in some cases. It sounds like the kind of debates they were having, there was no two good ideas. We could just find a middle ground between the two. It wasn't like picking Angular or Ember. It's like, oh, do we buy $100 million in ads, or do we buy a blimp and roam it around? And it's just like, there's no real good way to know the answer other than let's just keep arguing about it until we can decide if someone has to make a decision.
Flip a coin.
Yeah, exactly. I do agree. I like consensus better, but I think it is nice to have a backup person who's allowed to make a decision in case someone can't come up with a decision. But I've never worked on a team where that's been an issue. I've never been on a team where none of us can decide to a horrifying degree that someone else needs to come in and make a call for us. You know, we kind of feel like we're not being included, or our opinion doesn't matter. I feel like if I was in a group and we all said our opinion and someone's overrode it, you know, I worked on a project last year where I was the only person on the team who strongly recommended a certain tech stack, and I was overruled by like one vote. And that other tech stack we chose bit us in the butt like 15 times before deploy. And I was like, I'm not saying anything, but if you had done what I did, this wouldn't happen. At that point, maybe I wished I was the decider, but it was consensus, and we all learned a lot about what not to do with AWS.
Yep. Well, you always learn something. The only question is something that destroys your company as the cost of that learning.
Luckily, it wasn't that expensive. It was just a couple late nights.
But I do wonder if, and again, like sending things to committee is like the kiss of death, right? But if you can kind of have a compromise of maybe, choosing if it is a large team. If it's a small team, I really think it is generally possible to create consensus. And I think the manager should just be the decider at that point. Yeah. Assuming it's a technical manager, a team lead type more than a, manager who knows some tech words type. That the latter type of manager, which also unfortunately exists, is maybe not best suited to you. So and in that case, I hear having a designated decider. But if it's a large team and you really need to make a decision, maybe it's possible to have a very, very, very small committee, like 3 people, who are relatively representative of the sides in the debate. And the requirement is, you all must come to a consensus, or we will flip a coin.
Yeah. There was definitely a section, and I had an audiobook, so it's hard for me to get pages off the top of my head, but where she talked about having veto power, and it was weird because in the section, it basically was the implicit assumption there, once you've listened to or read the whole chapter, was that the intention was a concession would be made, and then the decider was there to just break ties or overrule if they decided something horrible, and let them know ahead of time that that's the potential. So I like that idea of, hey, I can override this if I have to, but then hopefully you don't have to. I always held that power as an instructor. I used to run little small agile teams with my code school students and have them build products, and I was like, yes, you can do whatever you want, but if it's a really, really bad idea, I have veto power and I can do that. And I only had to pull it out like maybe once in 7 cohorts. I'm like, no, you're definitely not storing passwords as text files. It's something horrible like that. I was like, no, this is going into a database. It's going to be, properly encrypted. But no, it's good. It's an interesting idea. There was a lot of chapters or different sections that talked about different types of meetings that I've never been in. And I'm like, okay, I can see the point of that. But I won't need it. So kind of the last thing I wanted to touch on, and then can pass it off to Ariel if he has anything else, was I really enjoyed this idea of being proactive and explicit about your culture. That is like literally something I could have written myself, which I probably did when I was starting Lunar Collective a little over a year and a half ago. Was so many companies are not started with an explicit culture. They're not started with explicit or proactive ideals or goals. So many companies just exist, and then they go, oh, we should do something about the way it works. And I've seen so many companies flounder under the fear of never changing anything because they don't want to break their culture, or our culture is X and it's really Y. And they just had their head in the sand and they don't really know what the culture of their company is. And like she said in the book, cultures can be self-replicating, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing, because a really bad culture that you're trying to stamp something out of, being self-replicating is a bad thing, because then you're just going to keep trying to squish it. It's going to keep popping back up again. But if you can get a good culture established, like that could just make the internals of your company a joy for your employees, for you, for everyone. And that's like such a goal for me personally over the next couple of years for my company, is to nurture and to be explicitly growing a culture that is inclusive and is diverse and cares about learning, cares about teaching, and cares about feedback, and that people enjoy their work. Like, I remember the first time I left work at a job I liked. Like, I remember it was weird. I'll never forget this day. I remember leaving work at 5 o'clock at a tech job where I was happy with my team and the code base and everything, and I just like cried in the car. Because I was just so happy. I was like, I didn't know this would ever happen to me ever. And like, I've had a lot of shitty jobs since then, and I've had good jobs since then. And like, that feeling is like something I want all of my employees to have when they go to work. You know, you'll have bad days, but the company itself should feel like a refreshing change to you versus this like entity that's pulling you down all the time.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good articulation of why values are so important, because the culture and the values that you have will decide, you know, what's the environment that your employees are spending, you know, half their waking hours in. That's going to have a big impact on their psyche and on your effectiveness as an organization. I recently had a conversation with my boss, who just quit to go found his own startup, and one thing he asked me was just sort of for my thoughts on, if I were starting a company now, looking at, you know, my own work experiences and, you know, the especially the elements of dysfunction that I've seen in the past. If I were to you know, rewind and do it all over, what are the things that I would do from the start that would that would radically change the outcome, as far as I can tell, at least. And one thing I said was, you have to have a statement of values from the get-go. You have to establish what your culture is in writing. And the importance of doing it really in writing is so that I mean, companies generally are not founded by one person. It's usually by a small team. And you have to be on the same page as to what are the values that you share that you want to create, because otherwise you're just going to basically be acting at cross purposes all the time. And the other part is that the values have to be meaningful. So to me, what that means is they explain what the organization establishes, or what the organization expects, from individuals. It establishes, and that's usually all that values are in most organizations, which is really not the ideal, because what they should also do is establish what the individuals can expect from the organization, what kind of environment, what kind of support they can expect. And the third thing is, and this is something that I learned from a blog post about the Fog Creek values, which made a really good point. I wish I remembered who wrote it, but it's one of the higher ups there. That your values should help employees make decisions. Basically the idea being that a value is only as valuable as you're willing to sacrifice for it. So if it's not important enough to sacrifice something else for it, then how much do you really value it at all? So one of the Fog Creek values is, we do not want to take money from you unless you are ridiculously happy with our product. I think that's more or less the language of that value. And that gives the customer service people the ability to say, okay, we're going to make decisions that will, in the short term, negatively impact the bottom line because we want to preserve user confidence in the product. So it helps them decide, when I have this option or that option, you know, there's another value. If it's broken, fix it. In other words, it's okay that you're pushing off other work. If you found something that's broken, you fix it. So it's all about helping people make decisions that are in line with the kind of environment that you're trying to create. And if you don't make that explicit, it's just going to happen, and it's not going to be what you want.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I actually created 2 sets of mission statements for my company when I started. And they're not in opposition, but one is internal and one is external.
Okay.
Because what I found was I had very explicit ideas for what I wanted to do with the company, and they weren't at odds, but they were, again, very internal versus very external. Like, and I felt like I needed both. So I have a set of like a mission statement for how we operate as a company, as a consultancy, working on other people's code. And I have an idea of like who we are. And maybe there's another term besides mission statement, and that's what I just need to do. But I have like internal mission statement. And it's like, you know, we believe in these values and these goals for how we operate as individuals internally. So those should, like, basically, I guess, one for guiding interpersonal decisions and one for guiding like client-focused decisions. Because for me, not to get just too personal on like my own thing, this whole episode's been me talking about my company. Is like,
which is great, by the way, because now, you know, we get to watch the principles and the ideas in the book, how they might be applied in a real life scenario. So I think this has been great.
Very true. We'll have to do a follow-up in like 6 months.
Exactly.
We'll bring some of my employees in and they'll be like, it's not working.
He's too radically candid. Stop.
Exactly. So what was I going with that? So like externally, you know, I'm building a consultancy. Like I want, you know, all of my clients to know we care about the highest, you know, quality of software, and we want to make sure that we're building value for them always. Like it's very similar to like agile values, but the idea is like, hey, you should know we care about you and that we are openly sharing information. Like we are not hiding. We don't have any trade secrets is a big thing for me. Like I've worked for so many consultancies that kind of hide everything. I was like, oh, well, that's how we do things. I was like, no. I want to instill the way we do things for you so that you can do your job better as well. Like I want everyone to kind of share from that. But then internally, you know, I want everyone who works for me and works for Lunar Collective to be like I said, they like their job, but also they feel like this is a place of growth. And if they don't stay here for a long time, that's not an indictment on them or the company. That's just the way life and careers go. Like jobs are transitive in nature, and this should feel like a place where you can go to, you know, pursue whatever dream it is you want to do next while you're continuing to learn and grow here as a developer, and then you move on whenever that occurs, you know. And I am interested to see how things go now that I have employees, plural, and what does that take shape in the long run? You know, how do I instill those values? Because it seems even in most cases when companies or books talk about instilling culture, they're talking about like at a company of 30 instilling culture. I'm not talking about a company of 4. You know, it's a little bit, the scale's off. Yeah, so I'm also curious to see where things go with that. But I should get those printed and framed somewhere instead of just sending people Google Doc links.
Absolutely. Well, that makes sure that they're kept top of mind.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to throw in one more thing that the book mentioned, which I think is also important, is that the values don't change, but the implementation does.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a matter of the company growing, or it can be a matter of just things happen and you realize that what you were doing isn't going to work. I mean, they gave the example of, you know, she wanted a informal office environment room with like a bunch of couches and whatever, and then like one morning they came in and like there was, you know, underwear strewn around. It was clear like somebody had sex the night before in the room, and it's like, okay, we need to think about another way to be informal, because we want to maintain that value, but this is not the right implementation because it leads to negative consequences. I think a lot of companies honestly have that same approach with alcohol, that they want to have a relaxed environment, but the implementation is not always helpful, to say the least. I mean, I can definitely say that, you know, it works. You know, it's fine to have a keg around the office if everyone's responsible about it, and if people aren't, then it's really bad.
Yeah, and you don't want to be in the situation where you find that out
The hard way.
the hard way after a few months of having a cake in the office. And like I felt like I was always a little bit aware of this just because I didn't drink growing up. So like working places where everyone drank, it was like, oh, this is weird. Okay, I have to figure out what beer tastes good. And the spoiler, the answer's none. But that was like something I had to kind of adjust to in the tech industry. But it became more aware to me as an instructor dealing with my students and having students who, were out of AA and like having parties, graduation parties, where just everyone has drinks. And it's just like, it's something you have to be conscious of. And it doesn't hurt anyone to offer a vegetarian platter. It doesn't hurt anyone to have non-alcoholic cocktails and to just limit like what is available. Like I've been in places where they had a hard rule, just no liquor, because that just opens up a different level of possibilities than having a few beers or a few wine spritzers at like a party, and I think there's a way to have that middle ground where you can be conscious of potential, consequences. Some of the stories in the book were, in my mind, kind of severe. Like I wouldn't actually have imagined that. Like I would imagine I've heard of stories of bad parties, but like normally they're jokey, not like the actually dangerous ones. And yeah, you just want to create a culture where no one has to feel like they need to leave the party or they don't want to go because of what it's going to be like, and that is the worst thing in my mind, even if I want a bottle of bourbon at my desk, if that makes anyone uncomfortable, I'm not going to have one, and I don't have one because of that. Like that portrays an image and a culture that I don't want to purvey. Like, I don't want to like give off, even if having whiskey at the desk I think is fun for me personally. I'll just keep it at home,
Yep. Sounds about right. It's hard because, the question always becomes, how much can you, twist and contort your practices, because there's practices that are, every practice has how hard it is to implement and what the gain is. And sometimes, it's really, really difficult to implement and the gains are minimal. Sometimes it's, it's the calculus is the opposite. And sometimes it really depends. Right now it's not a big deal, but then suddenly you hire 4 more workers and they're all, AA grads, and maybe your calculus changes. And I think that's exactly the point, that it has to be flexible, because it's not about, it's not about the values dictate that we do things one way. It's that the values dictate what our values are, and the implementation is going to change based on the actual people that we're working with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely worked with bosses and startup founders who incorrectly believe the culture that they enjoy or the memories they hold on to dearly are because of what they had done in the past, not because of the people they were with or because of the situation. Like, oh, no, don't you remember we had the ski trip and everyone got real drunk and we were all best friends for the next year? Like, I just want to have a drunken ski trip every year for the company because that's what'll keep us all best friends. And it's like, no, like you can't just continually force the same, like they're trying to force that same magic. Like something occurred there with that group of people at that time, and they think that's our culture. Our culture is ski trip, and we're going to do it every year, and that'll keep everything going the same way. And it's like, no, you got to be willing to let go of that thing happening in the past and adjust as the company grows, regardless if that's up or down or just sideways,
You gotta go from like slopes across country.
Yep.
But it's it's also like some people are parents and don't have flexibility, or they're caring for an elderly parent, on their own. Some people are just not that into your ski trip for they don't like skiing. I mean, it's going to depend on the people that you're working with, and the culture that you have within your team might be different than the culture for the whole company, and that's okay, because it all comes from the same set of values that have to be ultimately flexible.
Exactly. And that exactly what you said about someone having kids or having an elderly relative taken care of, like not accounting for that shows a blind spot in your own understanding of other people's lives. Like a friend of mine left a job because they were told basically, oh, we have a company all hands in like Europe in summer. And like, I have a kid, I can't go. And they're like, oh, okay, well, you need to be there. And they weren't going to like fire them over it, but they were like, this is serious. You need to be there. This is the only time we all get together and do this. And they made no concessions for bringing a husband and a wife or a kid, like you have to be there. It'll just like there's no healthcare there's no childcare provided, like figure it out. And it's like, that's a big burden for anyone who has a kid on your team to just say, figure it out, when other people just go, cool, plane trip, and they just jump on the plane, you know?
And by the way, childcare doesn't always help if the kid is like 12 and needs to be in school and can't miss a week. So, it's, you know, and if you don't have anybody like that on your team, then great. Like, go ahead, do the trip to Europe, but make it about those people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Okay, good. I think at this point we could continue to talk at length, but I'll kind of bring us back down. So I'll give my clothing thoughts. I'll let Ariel give his clothing thoughts, and then we'll be good for today. So I will say, overall, I really like this book. This is definitely a book I think I'm going to recommend to other people in management. Given what we said last time and some of the thoughts that Sarah May had brought up on Twitter, and it's not perfect. Like, there's definitely, I think this is a book that's worth having a discussion with someone, being very critical afterwards, because you need to put it through the lens of your company culture. It's not a one size fit all. It's not GTD, the Candor book. You read it and then everything's great. Like, you have to understand, you know, how this fits into the, you know, your current organization, but also that this is not a perfect answer, but it is a good answer. You know, there was a few spots in the second half where she said that, like, hey, listen, I'm not saying this way we did things at Google is perfect. I'm just saying I haven't seen anything better yet. So I'm going to try it until something better comes along. And I like the idea of not throwing something out because it's not perfect. You know, like, try something and iterate on it. Like, that's what we do as developers. That's what we can do with our processes. Like, iterate on your process, but start from somewhere. So many developers want to work on processes like they're working with C. They want to just write the whole world from scratch. It's like, no, we have frameworks you can adapt and you can adjust accordingly. So that's where I'm at. I had a good takeaway from that.
Yeah, I think I'm mostly gonna overlap with you. I mean, my thought is that, you know, if you think about like software patterns books, this is like a management patterns book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a broader framework which you can take something from. You can agree with it partially, disagree with it partially. You can accept the whole thing, wholesale, whatever you want. But there's a lot of patterns in here that either the exact thing that's described or a variation of it might be relevant within your organization. One thing I really liked, which we didn't even talk about, and that's okay, is career conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And that sequence of 3 conversations, which was worked out. Which, again, I'm not going to get into details now because we're like way over time. But I actually have been thinking about how to implement that with my own team, just to try it out, to see what happens, to see what I learn about people. You know, I have someone on my team who was programming in the age of punch cards, so I think that'll be a very interesting conversation. And you know, it's a nice opportunity to, you know, to open up, you know, to open a door and think about some bigger things. For myself, I mean, I would love for somebody to have that conversation with me, because I can't, you know, it's hard to direct yourself in that conversation. But, you know, so that's just one example, but there's a lot of patterns and ideas here that I'm going to let it simmer for a while. I'm going to think about it in the context of you know, just life and continuing my work and future books that we read. I'm sure some of these ideas are going to come up again, and it'll be interesting to see how things shake down ultimately. You know, what I do find is applicable from this book to my own work and to the organizations that I'm in. I also would definitely recommend it, not as a, you know, here's your guide, you know, go off and do it, have fun, but more as a data point, something to really think about seriously, to take away a lot of the patterns. I think some of the ideas for how to run certain meetings, I'm absolutely going to come back to if I ever have to run meetings like that. That means something about like how to promote fairly, how to fire fairly. I mean, we didn't even get into that, but those are a big deal. I wouldn't know what to say about it because I've never done it. But this gives me a really interesting starting point and a way to think about how to make those decisions in a way that's a lot more fair, and is really based on a lot of industry experience. I mean, she wasn't just drawing on her own experiences, right? This was, here's, you know, the things that Google tried and ended up working or not working, and here's what Apple tried. And it's drawing on a lot of different organizations, a lot of different experiences. And there's definitely a lot there. Again, how much is applicable to a small team, a large team, remains to be seen.
Yeah, completely agreed.
On the whole, 2 enthusiastic thumbs up.
Yeah, I can give it that too. Yeah, there was so much to talk about. We really could go for another hour if we wanted to go through each chapter, especially on the second half. It was very meaty. Like there was a lot to actually dive into.
Yes.
Compared to the first one. Because again, I think
we could have talked about every page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we definitely could have, and we would use up all of our 8 hours going through it. Yeah, I will definitely say to the success of the book, I was at lunch with some coworkers and not coworkers, friends of mine who were complaining about their job and their boss, and I told them the Radical Candor quadrants, and they were like, "Oh my god!" And they knew exactly where each one of their managers fit in the quadrant immediately because of it. It does work. It does help people relay information. I think that was a good takeaway. And just to reiterate, I really enjoyed the career progression talks. I'm going to try to implement something like that when I do my yearly reviews coming up, and then to see how that goes. All right. So I will use that to end us on this discussion of Radical Candor by Kim Scott. It was great. You should definitely pick it up if you haven't read it yet, although we spoiled the whole book for you. I don't know if we do book spoilers or not. But thanks again for joining us today. As always, you can stay updated. Oh, yes, next book. So the next book is Peopleware by Tori DeMarco and Timothy Lister. I have mine at home.
It's hard to see, but it says Tom.
Oh, Tom. Oh, I thought it said Tori. It says Tom. I just got mine at home today. I got an Amazon notification about it, so I'm excited to read Peopleware and see how that goes. But don't forget to follow us on Twitter at DevEmpathy. And please join us on Slack using the link on our site, devempathybook.club. It'd be great to be able to interact with you and to continually grow our community as we become better developers and better people. All right. Bye now.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.